Hello, my friends. Do you believe in fairies? Do you think that they're good? Bad? Well, the Miller family found out the hard way. These had been filled with laughter, the warm presence of his wife, Anna, and the innocent joy of his daughter, Tammy, and son, Andy. They had been his world, his everything. But all of that changed one cold, rainy night. The accident had come out of nowhere. A truck driver, asleep at the wheel, veered into the wrong lane, smashing head-on into their car. Brian had been at home, waiting for them to return from a short trip to visit Anna's parents. But instead of the sound of their car pulling into the driveway, he received a call from the hospital, informing him that his wife and daughter had been killed instantly. Only Andy, who had been asleep in the back seat, had survived, miraculously escaping with just a few bruises. The weeks following the accident were a blur of grief and disbelief. Brian couldn't understand how life could be so cruel, how everything could be taken from him in an instant. He had no time to process his feelings, no space to grieve. He was left alone with his son, a boy who had lost his mother and sister, and who now looked to Brian for comfort and guidance. But Brian had nothing left to give. Instead of being there for Andy, he began to withdraw. The pain was too much, the memories too vivid. Everywhere he looked, he saw Anna and Tammy, Anna's smile as she cooked dinner, Tammy's laughter as she played with her toys. It was unbearable, a constant reminder of what he had lost. And so, Brian turned to alcohol. It started with a drink to numb the pain, to help him sleep at night. But one drink turned into two, then three, until he was drinking every day, sinking deeper and deeper into a haze of intoxication. He didn't care about anything anymore, his job, his friends, or even his son. Andy, meanwhile, was left to navigate his grief alone. The little boy, who had once been full of life and energy, now spent most of his time in the garden, playing by himself. He would sit for hours on a small hill at the edge of the property, talking to his imaginary friends. Brian barely noticed. He was too consumed by his own misery, too lost in his own world to see that his son was slipping away from him. The house, once filled with warmth and love, became a cold, silent place. The curtains were always drawn, and the rooms were dimly lit. The laughter and joy that had once echoed through the halls were gone, replaced by the clinking of bottles and the sound of Brian's heavy, drunken footsteps. And so, time passed. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and Brian and Andy grew further and further apart, both lost in their own worlds of pain and sorrow. It was a chilly autumn morning when Brian awoke with the usual pounding headache that had become all too familiar. He groaned, rubbing his temples as he tried to shake off the remnants of sleep. The taste of stale whiskey lingered on his tongue, and the empty bottle lay on the nightstand beside him. He stumbled out of bed, barely noticing the clutter that had accumulated in his room, the dirty clothes, the unmade bed, the empty bottles scattered on the floor. He was used to the mess now. It had become a reflection of his life, chaotic and neglected. As he made his way to the bathroom, a nagging feeling tugged at the back of his mind. It was as if he had forgotten something, something important. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the feeling persisted, gnawing at him as he went through the motions of his morning routine. Hours passed, and the feeling didn't go away. It stayed with him, an uncomfortable itch that he couldn't scratch. It wasn't until he arrived at work that the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. "Hey, Brian," his co-worker, Mark, said as he passed by. "How's Andy doing? Did you guys have a good time yesterday?" Brian stared at him, confused. "Yesterday?" "Yeah, you know, for his birthday." Brian's heart stopped. He had forgotten Andy's birthday. He tried to hide the shock on his face, but it was too late. Mark had already seen it. "You did remember, right?" Brian forced a smile, though it felt like a grimace. "Yeah, of course. We had a great time." Mark raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. But he didn't press the issue. "Well, I'm glad to hear it. Take care, Brian." As Mark walked away, Brian felt a wave of guilt wash over him. How could he have forgotten his own son's birthday? The realization hit him hard. He had been so consumed by his grief and his drinking that he had neglected the one person who needed him the most. He felt sick to his stomach, not just from the hangover, but from the shame of what he had become. He had let his son down, just like he had let Anna and Tammy down. He had failed as a father, and now he was paying the price. That night, after putting Andy to bed, Brian went into the kitchen and began gathering up all the bottles of alcohol in the house. He threw them into a trash bag, one by one, until the cabinets and fridge were empty. He didn't stop until every last drop was gone. As he stood there, looking at the bag full of bottles, he made a promise to himself. He would do better. He would be there for Andy, no matter how hard it was. He would find a way to reconnect with his son, to be the father that Andy deserved. But it wouldn't be easy. Andy had grown distant, retreating into his own world, just as Brian had retreated into his. And the more Brian tried to reach out to him, the more it seemed like Andy was slipping away. Brian's first attempt to reconnect with Andy was simple. He asked him to go to the park. It was something they used to do all the time before the accident, and Brian thought it might be a good way to start rebuilding their bond. But Andy wasn't interested. "I want to stay in the garden," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. Brian frowned. "You spend a lot of time out there. Don't you want to do something different for a change?" Andy shook his head. "I like it out there. My friends are waiting for me." "Your friends?" Brian asked, puzzled. Andy nodded. "The fairies. They like it when I bring them shiny rocks. They play with me, and they tell me stories." Brian felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard this before, years ago, when Tammy was about Andy's age. She used to talk about imaginary friends, two fairies who lived on the hill in the garden. Anna had been concerned, thinking it was strange for a child Tammy's age to have such vivid imaginary friends. She had tried to discourage Tammy from playing on the hill, but Tammy had been insistent. She spent hours out there, just like Andy was doing now. Brian hadn't thought much of it at the time. He had chalked it up to a child's overactive imagination. But now, hearing Andy talk about the same thing, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something he had missed. "Andy," Brian said slowly, "do you ever hear strange noises at night? When you're out there with your friends?" Andy looked at him, his eyes wide and innocent. "Sometimes. They laugh and sing, and they tell me to come and play with them. But I'm not supposed to go outside at night. That's the rule." Brian felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He remembered hearing noises, too, soft, distant sounds that he had dismissed as the wind or animals. But now, he wasn't so sure. "Andy," Brian said, trying to keep his voice steady, "I want you to be careful out there, okay? Sometimes things aren't what they seem." Andy tilted his head, studying his father. "Are you scared of the fairies, Dad?" "They're nice to me. They said they can bring Mom and Tammy back." Brian's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Andy shrugged, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "They said they can bring them back if I help them. They miss them, too." Brian didn't know what to say. He felt a surge of panic rising in his chest, a sense that something was very, very wrong. But he didn't want to scare Andy. He forced a smile, though his heart was racing. That's nice of them, Andy. But we have to be careful, okay? We don't want to upset them." Andy nodded, accepting his father's words without question. "Okay, Dad. I'll be careful." But as Brian watched his son walk back out to the garden, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing Andy to something he didn't understand, something that had taken Tammy and Anna away from him. And he knew that he had to do something to protect his son, before it was too late. That night, Brian lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. He couldn't stop thinking about what Andy had said, about the fairies and their promise to bring Anna and Tammy back. It was impossible, of course. There was no such thing as fairies. But then, why did it feel so real? Why did he feel like there was something he was missing, something just out of reach? He tried to remember what had happened before the accident, tried to piece together the fragments of memories that had been buried by grief and alcohol. He remembered Anna being worried about Tammy, about her obsession with the hill and her imaginary friends. He remembered her telling Tammy not to go out there anymore, telling her that it wasn't normal, that she needed to play with real children. But there was something else, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He remembered Anna being upset, talking to him late at night, telling him that something was wrong. But he had dismissed her concerns, telling her that Tammy was just a child, that it was just a phase. And then, not long after that, the accident happened. Brian sat up in bed, his heart pounding. Could it be that the fairies, whatever they were, had something to do with it? Had they punished Anna for trying to keep Tammy away from them? It was ridiculous, of course. Fairies didn't exist. But the more he thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fit together. The noises at night, the strange feeling he got whenever he looked at the hill, the way Andy was drawn to it, just like Tammy had been. And then there were the dreams. They started that night, vivid and unsettling. In the first dream, Brian was standing by the hill, watching as two figures emerged from the shadows. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, like something out of a Victorian painting. Their faces were pale, almost lifeless, but their eyes were full of emotion, anger, sadness, longing. "Don't take him away," one of them said, her voice cold and hollow. "He belongs with us." Brian tried to move, tried to run, but he was frozen in place. The other figure stepped forward, her hand reaching out to him. "We can bring them back," she whispered. "We can make you whole again." And then he woke up, drenched in sweat, his heart racing. The dream felt so real, so vivid, that he could still hear their voices, could still feel the chill in the air. The next day, Brian tried to shake off the dream, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But when he looked at Andy, playing in the garden with his imaginary friends, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. That evening, he finally broke down and told Andy that they needed to leave, that they had to move away from the house, from the garden, from the hill. Andy looked up at him, his eyes wide with confusion. "But why, Dad?" "The fairies said I could stay with them forever. They said they'd take care of me." Brian's heart sank. "I know, Andy, but I don't think it's safe here. I think we need to go somewhere else, somewhere where we can be together, just the two of us." Andy's lower lip trembled, and for a moment, Brian thought he was going to cry. But then, Andy's expression hardened, and he shook his head. "No, Dad. I want to stay. The fairy said they'd bring Mom and Tammy back, and then we could all be together again." Brian felt a wave of desperation wash over him. He didn't know what to do, how to reach his son, how to convince him that they needed to leave. That night, the dreams returned, more vivid and terrifying than before. The fairies were angry this time, their faces twisted with rage. "You broke the rules," they hissed. "You can't take him away from us." Brian tried to run, but the ground beneath him gave way, and he was falling into darkness. The last thing he heard before he woke up was their laughter, cold and cruel, echoing in his ears. The next morning, Brian knew that they had to leave, that it was the only way to protect Andy. He called a real estate agent and arranged for them to come and look at the house the next day. He didn't care about the money or the memories anymore. He just wanted to get as far away from the hill as possible. But that night, everything changed. Brian woke to the smell of smoke, the sound of crackling flames. He jumped out of bed, his heart racing, as he realized that the house was on fire. He ran to Andy's room, but it was empty. Panic surged through him as he searched the house, calling Andy's name, but there was no answer. And then he heard it, the sound of laughter, coming from the garden. He rushed outside, and there, standing on the hill, were the two fairies, their faces illuminated by the firelight. Andy was standing between them, his face expressionless, as they held his hands. "Andy!" Brian shouted, running toward them. "Andy, come back!" But the fairies didn't let go. They smiled at Brian, their eyes filled with malice. "You can't take him away from us," one of them said. "He belongs with us now." Brian lunged forward, but it was too late. The fairies and Andy disappeared into the darkness, leaving Brian alone, surrounded by flames. The fire consumed the house, and by the time the fire department arrived, it was too late. The house was reduced to ashes, and there was no sign of Brian or Andy. The neighbors would later say that they had heard strange noises that night, laughter, voices, coming from the hill. But when they looked, there was nothing there, just the charred remains of the house. And so, the story of Brian and Andy Miller ended in tragedy, a cautionary tale of loss, grief, and the dangers of not listening to the whispers in the dark. The fairies had claimed their prize, and the hill remained, silent and watchful, waiting for the next family to move in. For in the end, no one ever really listens to the warnings, until it's too late.